Islam and he will break all the crosses. That the Quran says in chapter 4, verse 157, they did not kill or crucify him, who's they, of course, the Jews, who were boasting of having crucified him in the Quranic record. They did not kill or crucify him, but it appeared so unto them. They thought they had crucified him, but actually Allah had performed a deception because he is the best of schemers, as the Quran also tells us, and had fooled them into thinking they had crucified Jesus when actually they had not. So to speak of the cross is intrinsically offensive to Muslims, and to speak of an Islamic crusade is intrinsically offensive to Muslims, but it also ought to be intrinsically offensive to all of us here and to any European or American, whether or not we are Christian, because there is actually no parallel between violence committed in the name of Islam and violence committed in the name of Christianity. Now understand me well, I am not saying that Muslims have all been evil and Christians have all been good. Christians have done terrible things in history and justified them by means of Christianity. There's no doubt about that, and there's no gainsaying that. And that actually is one thing that you will hear Westerners saying, because we have a generally healthy tradition of self-criticism. Sometimes it can be unhealthy, I believe. But a generally healthy tradition of self-criticism that is absolutely, completely absent in the Islamic world. So you will never hear a Muslim saying, never, never. If you ever do, I will give you a large sum of money. But never have I heard, in years and years of reading material written by Muslims daily, never have I heard any Muslim ever say, well, certainly Muslims have done wrong in the past, have committed historical evils. Never. But in any case, I digress. The reality of the Crusades is that they were, as I alluded to earlier, a defensive action that was actually late, quite delayed, and small scale. At the time of the Islamic jihads that I mentioned before, that overwhelmed Syria and Egypt and North Africa and Persia and it swept up into Western Europe, occupied Sicily for a time, and went into Italy also. At the time of these invasions and conquests, most of that land was Christendom. It was actually the most important part of Christendom at that time. If you have at all looked into the history of the first millennium of the church, the church's, you could call it sacred geography, was quite different from what it became in the second millennium. There were 5 patriarchates, 5 centers of Christianity in terms of centers of Christian theology and Christian liturgical development. And 4 of them were in what we now know of today as the Islamic world. And only 1 was not, and that was Rome. Constantinople was the location of the largest and most influential church in Christendom, which is now a mosque, well, now a museum, but it is a museum in which Islamic prayer is allowed and Christian prayer is not, the Hagia Sophia. But 4 of the 5 patriarchates being in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and then being overwhelmed by Islam, what essentially happened was that the theological center, the center of the development of early Christianity, and the liturgical center for Eastern Christianity, and what amounted to over half of Christendom at that time, was overwhelmed and conquered by the Islamic jihadis. And the Christians, being riven by schisms and distracted by various other interests, did not respond. And 450 years went by. The circumstances of the First Crusade being called are very, very ill known. In reality, there was no imperialistic invasion. There was no imperialistic intent. There were imperialists, and they did establish kingdoms, but they were actually transgressing against the stated goals and the stated methods that they had agreed to before they left. They were actually departing from what they had promised to do. The reason why the First Crusade was called, because the Byzantine emperor, the Eastern Roman emperor, Alexius Comnenus, actually appealed to the Pope for help in the latter part of the 11th century. because he was seeing, especially after the Battle of Manzikert in 1078, he was seeing his domains completely overwhelmed. And Asia Minor, now known as Turkey, which was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, was completely overwhelmed, conquered. Constantinople was endangered. The other great seas of early Christendom, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, had been conquered centuries past. There was no chance of recovering them. Not only was the Byzantine Empire, which even despite the schism between the East and West, which was fresh at that time, was only 25 years old, and thus was something that people had no idea was going to stretch on for another millennium and see no hope of being healed at any time. At that time, it was one in a series, actually, of schisms that had been healed previously. And there was no sense of this great divide between the East and West, which developed later. In any case, there was the appeal from the Byzantine emperor. There was also the threatening of the Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land and the Christian residents of the Holy Land who had been there since the time of Christ himself. In the early part of the 11th century, the Caliph al-Hakim, who is a fascinating historical figure who later decided he himself was God. Before he did that, however, he's actually worshipped by the Druze. You may have encountered the Druze, who have been variously allies of the Israelis, allies of the Lebanese, depending on which Druze you ask. But in any case, the Druze are very secretive about their religion, but it does have to do with this erratic and probably insane caliph who deified himself. But before he did that, he decided that the Christians were all going to have to stop this heretical business, because in Islam, in traditional Islam, Christianity is a heretical twisting of the original Islamic message of the Prophet Jesus. And so they were going to have to cut this out. And he started to destroy the churches. He destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and had it completely razed, completely obliterated. No stone upon stone, nothing. And destroyed thousands, literally thousands of churches in the Holy Land at the same time, in the early part of the 11th century. And at that time, there was a more or less steady stream of pilgrims visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other sites in Jerusalem, as they still do today. And they were increasingly beset by people, by Muslims who, in the name of Islam, would work to subjugate them, would conquer them, would attack them, and often kill them. Now, nothing happened. Nobody did anything about any of this. But it was all going on. And al-Hakim actually, at the time that he decided that he himself and not Allah was God, he stopped it, and he actually ordered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre rebuilt. But the Christians were still in very desperate straits in the Holy Land. And so it was out of the appeal from the Byzantine emperor and the condition of the pilgrims in the Holy Land that the Pope called the First Crusade in order to secure the Holy Land for these pilgrimages. Now, as I said before, the Crusaders did some terrible things, and I'm not saying that their record was spotless by any means. One of the first things they did was, on their way across Europe, was attack Jews, which was not only evil in itself, but it was strategically ridiculously foolish. The great historian Bat Yaor has argued in her groundbreaking studies of dhimmitude, which is the institutionalized second-class status that Islamic law mandates for non-Muslims under Islamic rule, and there'll be more on that later. She has argued, quite cogently I believe, that it is imperative at this time for the historical dhimmi communities, the communities of those non-Muslims who were subjugated under the rule of Islamic law and will be subjugated again if Islamic rule is established anywhere in the world, it is imperative for them to band together